Hello and welcome to another edition of Spiritual Awakening Ministry. My name is Rob Baker, Senior Evangelist. Last week we went through a portion of Exodus where the children of Israel, the Israelites were exiled out of Egypt, started their way into the wilderness and ended up at the base of Mount Sinai. And then Moses was called up by God and was given the 10 Commandments. And so last week we went through each of the 10 Commandments and its relevancy, not only through history, but also with relevancy in our own nation and our own laws, what we call Western civilization. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, make sure you go review last session's training to learn more about the 10 Commandments and some really important information that you probably don't know about. So today we're going to pick up and continue off where the Israelites are in the wilderness. And we're going to be talking a little bit about God's, I'll call it recommissioning or re-promise of his covenant that he created with Abraham, and then basically stipulating that covenant again with Moses. And especially the covenant in regards to, look, you're in the wilderness right now, but I'm going to be leading you into the promised land. So it's important to understand where the promised land was historically, and then also who are the inhabitants of the promised land. Now, before we get into that, we always like to kind of start off each week with some topics in what we like to call biblical prophecy in the news, things that are happening in our society that relate to what the Bible has to say. As you know, we're in the holiday season, kicking off Thanksgiving. And as you know, for those of you that are shoppers out there, there's this thing known as Black Friday. Well, Black Friday is this event that people end up after Thanksgiving dinner at maybe midnight or beyond, starting early Friday morning. People are all rushing to the stores to get the so-called hot deals. But this kind of shows and reflects in regards to what I like to say, the decay of society that Jesus spoke about, the prophets spoke about, and also people like Apostle Paul spoke about. And when we take a look at this particular article that we pulled up in regards to Black Friday, it says here, shoppers threw punches in Walmart wrestling TVs and merchant scrums. There's another article from WSFA. They reported an incident in a Galleria, a mall, where witnesses heard two separate shootings, gunfire, and it happened in an area between JCPenney's and a foot action near a food court. And basically all the malls and all these areas are heavily policed as a result of kind of, I like to say, anarchy that takes place during this time. And this kind of brings me back to what Jesus said in Matthew 24, 10 through 13, when he talked about during the last days, there's going to be an escalation of selfishness, unrest, rioting. In Romans 1:21 through 23, Paul talked about, people becoming cold-hearted and evildoers. And when you take a look at, for example, Zephaniah 1:18, it talks about the love of money and possessions. In Proverbs 31:30, it talks about the love of self. Proverbs 16:5, prideful in a non-humble society. When we talk about some of these things that are taking place, it's just, once again, things that the Bible talked about and predicted about that are not only sinful, but also signs of the times when these type of activities would be increasingly escalating, or what we call exponential growth, just growing at rapid levels. And once again, when we take a look at where society is today, the decay of society is no doubt happening. And why is that? Well, it's happening because removing God out of the classroom, out of school, out of society, results in anarchy and chaos. And once again, Jesus said that in the last days, in the final days, prior to his arrival and the rapture, it would be like the days of Noah. And as we all know, in the days of Noah, Noah built an ark, and then there was a flood, and God pretty much destroyed the world and saved the 8 people in the ark because the world was so evil. And that's where we're getting at today in our decay of society over something so trivial. People beating each other up, people killing each other over material items, over shopping because they wanted to have the greatest TV or the greatest, iBox or whatever else is out there that they're trying to buy that's going to be meaningless a year after they've purchased it. So this, once again, to me, really reflects in regards to what's happening in today's society. Also, we always like to talk about some of the things that are happening against the nation of Israel. The Bible indicates that in the last days that all nations will be coming against the nation of Israel. And just understand that Israel has been attacked ever since they became a nation in 1948. And the United States has been one of its best allies over the years, even though we've had certain presidents that have been somewhat anti-Israel. For the most part, the United States has been very pro-Israel. And I really believe that as a result of that, our nation has been blessed. For God said that I will bless those that bless Israel and curse those that curse Israel. And this is a covenant. It goes back all the way back to Abraham. So when we talk about all nations coming against Israel as a biblical prophecy, first of all, Israel had to become a nation, which was in 1948. They had to take control of Jerusalem in 1967, which happened in the Six-Day War. But it's been a divided, we'll call it, city in terms of politicism until the United States, with President Trump, declared that Jerusalem is the actual eternal capital of the nation of Israel, which is actually a big deal. But here's what's interesting. The United Nations is supposed to represent all global nations. And when you take a look at this article where Israel is continuously picked on by all of these nations, and they bring their grievances into what's called the UN Human Rights Council, which is a complete joke. And this council of criminals condemns Israel continuously, always trying to side with the so-called Palestinians, which, by the way, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. These are Arabs that are basically trying to invade, destroy, and take over a sovereign nation of Israel. And so when Israel defends itself, these rogue nations around the world try to make Israel look like the bad guy, the bad person. So they're always bullying and coming against the nation of Israel. And once again, thank God for a current president that we have that actually supports the nation of Israel, and having a UN ambassador that actually supports the nation of Israel. But the question I would ask is, where's the UN Human Rights Council on abuses and torture and killings that are happening in China? Or how about North Korea or Iran or many Arab countries, Arab countries where those that don't believe in Islam are persecuted and tortured and killed. You can't build a church or a synagogue in the majority of Arab countries throughout the world. How about the evil that's going on in South Africa, where landowners are having their lands taken away through a wink by the government and using it as an excuse for what's known as apartheid, paying back. And so you have South Africans who own farms being beaten, raped, murdered, and their lands taken, and the government doing nothing about it. Where's the UN Human Rights Council about that? How about all the African genocides that's been happening over decades, where Christians are being persecuted and murdered because they're Christians? It's just so hypocritical when you take a look at what's happening. But once again, this comes down to what the Bible predicted, that the nation of Israel would have all nations coming against it, and the nation of Israel and Jerusalem would be a trembling cup for the world during the last days, which once again is happening today. Here's an interesting one. This falls into what I like to call the category of twisting of truth and anti-Semitism. Once again, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. But also, in regards to twisting of truth in regards to history. So you have this guy by the name of Farrakhan, who is the Nation of Islam leader, who goes around and touts himself as being the head of Islam in the United States, and is a global trotter to a lot of the Arab nations that believe in Islam and hate the United States. And here's a guy that's living in the United States, a United States citizen, that's going abroad and condemning the United States on enemy territory. I mean, in all reality, this is almost to, I would call the lines of treason. This is to the lines of someone that is providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. When you have a United States citizen going to a place like Iran and basically calling for harm against the United States and Israel. And so when we talk about this guy, he simply twists truth. Obviously, he promotes Islam, promotes the Bible as being fake, basically goes in and talks about how non-blacks were created by rogue scientists 6,000 years ago, how he denies the Holocaust, how he denies the Promised Land where the nation of Israel resides today. Basically, everything in regards to historical facts about the nation of Israel, about the Bible, about Christianity, he denies all of that, twists the truth, and people actually believe it. So the Bible told us, and Jesus told us, that in the last days there'd be an increase of false prophets, false teachers, twisting of truth, anti-Semitism. Jesus said that you'd be hated for my sake, so anti-Christian. And once again, this is another example of the type of hypocrisy that goes on, not only in the world, but specifically in our nation with our own politicians. And I like to say, where's the DNC and the liberals who preach tolerance, who teach, you're not supposed to victimize anybody? And these people have no problem sitting at funerals with this guy Farrakhan, or sitting in his presence in political rallies and things like that. But they go out and they persecute those that support Israel, support Christianity. And this, once again, gives a great indication of what the Bible talked about to be looking for as signs in the final days. So this is a really hot topic for me, especially with the fact that we have such hypocrisy going on in our own government, in our own nation, and our own people, allowing this type of intolerance to take place. So let's go ahead and get into part 4 of our historical overview and importance of Israel. Once again, we're going to really focus on the promise that God had of the Israelites leaving the wilderness and ultimately going into the promised land. But it's really important to understand who were the inhabitants of the promised land, because once again, that truth is a lie today. That truth of the promised land and who the inhabitants were is twisted today to where you have politicians and people in the Middle East and people that have a motive of hatred towards Christianity and Judaism, that the promised land was meant for the Arabs, and that the Israelites, the Jewish nation that's in place today, are basically occupiers, people that are occupying a land that belong to what's known as Palestinians. And I just once again want to reiterate, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. There's never been a nation of a Palestinian. There's never been a group of people of Palestinians. It's basically a term used, not a legitimate nation or empire or country that was ever ratified or recognized. So let's go through and understand the importance of the history of who was residing in the promised land. And once again, note that there's no Palestinians. And we'll get into terminology a little bit later, but let's get into kind of what we're going to be talking about in regards to historical events, things that we're not taught today in our educational indoctrination centers. We're taught things that actually are not truthful. We're not taught in school today. The youth of our nation are taught lies. And here's the truth. When you take a look at history, whether it's biblical or secular, there's no denying the truth, the facts, archaeological evidence. So here's kind of how it was in the days when the Israelites were in the wilderness and who controlled what. So you had the land of Canaan, which God said would ultimately be where the promised land was. And the land of Canaan was inhabited by many small nations. Matter of fact, a lot of them were known as tribes. And if you take a look at all these different nations and tribes, this is kind of like who encompassed that area of Canaan, that God made a specific edict that those people would be removed. And why would God remove those people? Well, first of all, God decides who lives in any land. God is the owner of the world, the creator of the world. So God dictates who's going to be living where. But these people basically rejected God and worshiped false gods. So God basically proclaimed a judgment on these people that were following false gods and conducting tremendous evil in this area of the world. And so when God said, hey, we're going to be moving you into the promised land, God's plan was that I'm going to remove these people that are evil, these people that are worshiping false gods, and have the Israelites come into this nation, be the lantern for the world, to basically be the light of the world. That was the original intent of the nation of Israel, to be worshiping the one true God and have them be the testimony of the power of God, taking them from Egypt out of slavery into the promised land and removing all of these nations. How could any small group of people do that without an actual living, almighty, all-knowing God being in the lead of doing this? So in Exodus 23:20, where we're picking up, it says, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to a place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies, and I will oppose those who oppose you. My angel will go ahead of you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, and I will wipe them out. Do not bow down before their gods or worship them or follow their practices. You must demolish them and break their sacred stones to pieces. Worship the Lord your God, and his blessings will be on your food and your water. He'll take away your sickness. You won't have miscarriages. You won't be barren in the land, and he'll give you a full lifespan. So once again, what's God saying here? God's saying here, look, I'm going to be going ahead of you. I am going to be doing supernatural things to clear your path so you don't actually have to be a part of this battle. So God's saying supernaturally, I'm going to be going ahead of you and I'm going to be taking these people out. But once these people are taken out and you are in the promised land, I'm warning you, don't do what I know you're going to do. Because once again, God knows the future. He's already telling them, giving them a warning. Don't worship their gods. Don't worship, their false deities. And if you do, these are the things that I'm going to do or not do to you. And so God's saying, listen, if you follow me, you're going to be blessed. If you don't follow me, there's going to be major problems. As we continue on in Exodus 23:27, it says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all of your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send the hornets ahead of you to drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites out of your way. But I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little will I drive them out before you until you've increased enough to take possession of the land. So once again, God's talking about the plan of who he's going to remove and where this future promised land is going to be. And so God is laying out this covenant that was once again given to Abraham and recommissioned with Moses and the Hebrews that left Egypt. So in Exodus 23:31, it says, I will establish your borders. Real important, I underline borders, because today, right, we're in a political hissy in our country in regards, should our nation have its own borders? The fact is, God defined borders. That is an absolute fact. And so it's interesting what God says here. It says, I will establish your borders. And here's once again, God defining where the borders of Israel is going to be. God doesn't say, hey, the nation of Israel is going to be all over the world or wherever they go. God says, look, here's the designated area, the actual borders, the borders from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, from the desert to the Euphrates River. That is the borders of the nation of Israel that God proclaimed. I will give into your hands the people who live in the land, and you will drive them out before you. Do not make a covenant with them or with their gods. Do not let them live in your land, or they will cause you to sin against me, because the worship of their gods will certainly be a snare to you. This is an interesting verse, because this is something that the United States of America has definitely been in violation of. We, although are not a theocracy in this country, but our country was in fact based on Judeo-Christian principles, and we should not be ashamed of that. And if anyone's coming to the United States, they should understand our history, our heritage, the roots of our nation, and the fact that we were founded as a Judeo-Christian country, that we worship a one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if anyone's coming into our country, they need to respect that. And especially for those that are secularists, or people that are atheists, or those that believe in other religions, that at the end of the day, you're here as a result of the blessings that the one true triune God provided for the founders of this country, and you're benefiting from that. And there's a lot to be learned from the history of the nation of Israel, because we are actually falling into the same trap that the nation of Israel did. Our nation is falling into what God calls the snare, conducting treaties with people that we shouldn't be conducting treaties with, allowing people into our country. Great, that's fine. But when those people come into our country as refugees, or whether they're legal aliens, whatever they may be, they should be willing to adopt our customs, our traditions, our faiths as a sovereign nation, not bringing their false gods, not bringing their false politics into our country to cause the same thing in the country that they actually left. And it kind of reminds me of where we are in the United States. You know, you take a state like Texas. Texas is a great state to live in, a state that believes and supports the Constitution, a state that has low regulation, non-taxation, supports the Second Amendment. You know, it's a great state to do businesses. To where you take a look at a state like California. I originally come from California. California at one time was a Republican state. You know, Ronald Reagan was a governor of California. California voted for the first George Bush and for Ronald Reagan. So when you take a look at California and where it is today compared to what it was, 20, 30 years ago, it's a complete opposite. And it's a result of a change in the belief system of the majority of those that vote in the state of California. And it just reminds me so much of bringing false gods, false ideology into an area and destroying a state. But what's really sad is that those same people that have their state destroyed leave that state because they can no longer afford the taxes, they can't afford the cost of living, they can't afford the things that cause that state to go into chaos. They now leave and go to a state like Texas and bring their garbage with them. Same thing happening here. What God's saying is, look, if you have people coming in from another nation or from some other empire or some other tribe or whatever into your land, don't make a covenant with those that are against me, against my word, against my laws. However, if they're willing to convert, if they're willing to abide, then fine, let them come into your lands. Okay, that is what's called legal immigration. Not bringing what you want to bring because you think you have a right to come into wherever you think you need to come in. But then again, also, once again, God defining what the lands and the borders are going to be. So understand, everyone, that when we hear in today's political realm and the fake news media that there's no such thing as borders and we have no right to defend our borders, we have no right to determine who comes into our nation, that's absolutely not true. I can't stand those that are one day preaching women's health care through the murder of unborn children. What we call abortion is some kind of right in the Constitution, when in actuality it's not. And then we have a situation here where those same people are saying, Jesus says, feed all the poor, and we need to have open borders. So here you have the hypocrites on one side not obeying God's law through the fruit of the womb and being blessed for the unborn, deciding to kill those that are created by God. But then on the other hand saying, well, I'm religious and I believe in God, and God says that we shouldn't have borders and everyone should just come on in and we should take care of everybody. I mean, you can't have it both ways. So once again, this falls back to what we talked about at the beginning, in twisting of truth, the twisting of biblical facts, and once again, a sign of the times. So as you notice, I'm real passionate about this because it's important to understand that the decay of our nation is a result of where we have allowed our nation to go to, and who we've allowed into this nation, and who we've allowed to run our nation, and who the voice of our nation has been. So the Bible continues to say, you must destroy them totally, make no treaty with them, show no mercy, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters as your sons. Once again, I'll document it in Deuteronomy 7, 1-3. Now, once again, why was God so, we'll call it stern in this area, stern with this decree? Because God knew what was going to happen. God knew that the nation of Israel would one day fall into this trap. And actually it happened through King Solomon. King Solomon was supposed to be the wisest king and the wisest person in the history of the world. Well, he wasn't too wise in going against God's laws and God's rules. And Solomon did absolutely everything that God said do not do. He allowed intermarriage. He allowed himself to intermarry. He created covenants with his wives from other nations that worshiped other gods, and allowed those temples to come into the sacred lands, the promised lands that God gave, which ultimately caused the downfall of the nation of Israel to be divided. And look where we are in our country today. Our country is completely divided. And the Bible says, and Jesus says, a house that's divided will not stand. And so it's real important to understand the correlation between the history of the nation of Israel and what's going on today with the United States. So let's take a look at who the people, the inhabitants of the Promised Land were. And these are historical people. These are people that aren't fables. This isn't like Zeus or the Greek gods or, any type of a story. These are legitimate nations and settlements and tribes in historical, we'll call it historical, Moses days, the people that were inhabitants of the Promised Land of Canaan. So the first we're going to talk about is the Amorites. So who are the Amorites? The Amorites were known as the Semitic people who occupied the city west of the Euphrates from the second half to the third millennial BC. The Bible refers to them as what's known as the Highland Mountaineers. So whenever you hear in the Bible the term Highland Mountaineers, they're talking about the Amorites. And once again, they inhabited the land of Canaan. Basically, it's described in Genesis 10:16 as the descendants of Canaan and the son of Ham. The Amorites worshipped a god called Amaru, which is known as the storm, sky, and mountain god. Once again, worshiping a false god. Biblical meaning of the name Amorite is bitter, a rebeller, and a babbler. So that's a little information about who the small nation of the Amorites were and where they were in conjunction with the map. The next are the Hittites. The Hittites were an empire flourishing from around 2300 BC to about 1100 BC. They were in continuous war with Egypt. A lot of Egypt artifacts show war and conquering of the Hittites. And the Hittites were, once again, one of 12 major empire tribes living in or near Canaan in what God defined as the Promised Land since the time of Abraham to the time of Ezra after the return of the Babylon exile. In Genesis 10, 1 through 6, it documents that they were descendants of Heth, the son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham and born to Noah. And they worshiped many false gods. So they worshiped the god of Ias, the god of wisdom, Adrarchi, the god of diviner, Alalas, the primordial entity, Apollonius, god of the city of Walusa, one of their capital cities, Arena, the sun god. So they had pretty much a god for everything. Once again, not worshiping the one true God. Next are the Perizzites. The Perizzites were known as the villagers, and they lived in an open country. They didn't have walled cities. The Perizzites dwelled in a region south and southwest of Mount Carmel in what was known as the best fertile land in the central portion of Canaan. And once again, here's a map that kind of breaks down where these nations kind of had the majority of their people living. Some were divided, some were all in one location. When Israel entered the Promised Land under Joshua, the Perizzites were living in the forested hill country in territories that would be ultimately assigned to Ephraim, Manasseh, and Judah. And you could learn more about that in Joshua 11, 3, 17, and 15. The Israelites, once again, committed a sin against God, which God knew was going to happen, but he also pre-warned them. They had intermarried with Perizzites and other inhabitants of Canaan, and just full disobedience of God's command. And it's just amazing how God, warns everybody what's going to be happening. And typically we should take these warnings as God knows that's what's going to happen. So it's not like God was shocked or surprised. God knew what was going to happen and allowed things to move forward as it was supposed to, because free will. God allows the free will to take place, but God's ultimate design and ultimate plan was for something different, knowing that it was going to be messed up and then he would fix it later anyways. Next are the Canaanites. The Canaanites originate from Canaan, the son of Ham and the grandson of Noah, and was the father of what's known as the Canaanites. He was the recipient of the so-called curse of Ham. So when we take a look at the Canaanites, they were also divided into areas in the land of Canaan, and they worshiped false gods, but real terrible false gods. Gods that required sacrifice, human sacrifice. Just unbelievable in regards to what the Canaanites were all about. So they worshipped a god called Baal, which they considered to be the god of fertility, the god of El, the god of creation, the god of Asherah, the goddess of heaven, so a female god, and another female god called Astarte, the goddess of the sky. So they had the goddess of the heaven and the goddess of the sky. And Canaan meant, in the word for Canaan means merchant, trader, or that humbles and subdues. So Canaanites were obviously a big, important historical people in that land of Canaan. Next are the Hivites, and they're mentioned in Genesis 10. They're the descendants of Heth, son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham and the son of Noah. The name is interpreted as Midlanders or villagers, and they're mentioned during the conquest under Joshua, Joshua 9, 7, and 11, and 19, and a remnant of them still existed in the time of Solomon in 1 Kings 9 through 20. Next are the Jebusites. They were the descendants of a guy by the name of Jebus, a descendant of Canaan, Ham's son, and a Canaanite tribe who inhabited Jerusalem prior to its conquest by Joshua and King David. So the book of Kings, as well as in 1 Chronicles 11:14, state that Jerusalem was previously known as the city of Jebus prior to it actually ultimately being taken over. The Jebusites lost the battle against Joshua, who killed their king Adonizedek, but a remnant once again managed to stay in Jezebel until the invasion of King David. And then King David would ultimately take them out. So in 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10, the Jebusites fought against King David's arrival in the city that would ultimately be changed from Jebus to Jerusalem. So when David invaded and conquered the city, that became David's stronghold, and he ultimately called it not only Jerusalem, but the city of David. Next are the Moabites. The Moabites were a member of a Semitic people living in the Moab in biblical times. They were descendant of Lot. This was Abraham's nephew in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. They lived in the mountain tracts of the land of Jordan. The land lies alongside much of the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. They worshipped a god called Shemosh, meant destroyer, subduer, or the fish god. They're talked more about in Judges 11:24. The Moabite daughter-in-law of Naomi and Elimelech were Jews, a biblical story. And after the death of her husband, Ruth married Naomi's kinsman Boaz. The son Obed was the ancestor of David and Jesus. So this is the story of Ruth, illustrates the conversion of a non-Jew into the grafting of Israel, of the nation of Israel. So it's interesting how the Moabite actually has a descendant that basically ultimately tracks back to the lineage of Jesus, and how that shows how God is able to take the Gentile and graft him in to what we call the promised people. So when we talk about the promised people, the Israelites, remember that God is the God of all people, the Jews and the Gentiles, but his favor was for the Jews because the Jews were supposed to be the light, I'll call it the light tower of God and God's laws and who God is. And unfortunately, God knew that they weren't going to live up to the obligations, and God had a plan, and that plan was through Jesus Christ. And it's interesting how Jesus Christ's lineage came through, the lineage of David, and through Ruth, and through Boaz. So God used a Moabite in terms of the lineage of Jesus, and showing the grafting and how the Gentile would be grafted into the ultimate covenant in God's promise. So the next one are probably the most famous inhabitants of the land. Those are the Philistines. They're the well-known biblical adversaries to Israel. They include the battle between David and Goliath, and the ultimate deaths of Samson and Saul. The book of Joshua documents their major cities of Ashkelon, Gaza, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, and they controlled that area for over 3,000 years, or actually 3,000 years ago. And the Philistines originated in what's known as Kaftor, the name or the island of Crete. So when we say originated, they were not born in that region or area. They were not what we'll call Arabs, of Ishmael. These were people that were more in the line of, and when I say Ishmael, also remember through some of the other lineages of Noah. But when we talk about the Philistines were not of, we'll just call it Arab descent in that area of Canaan, or we'll just call it Canaan descent. They were actually from the land or island of what we know today as Crete, and they were what's known as the Aegean region. So they actually took boats, and they were known as shipbuilders, and they sailed across the Mediterranean into what we know today as the area of Gaza. And so the Philistines, which were known as, big, large people. Once again, that's where David and Goliath come from. They were worshipers of three gods, Astaroth, Dagon, and Beelzebub, each of which had shrines in all of these different cities. So once again, when God said that he wanted to wipe all these people out, he was wiping them out for a reason. It wasn't just because God is, wanting to commit genocide. God is wanting to get rid of the evil that was in this area, and God was going to use this area known as the Promised Land, and once again, where he was going to establish the one true faith, the one true people. And so King David would ultimately defeat them, and ultimately leaving no trace of historical lineage even to this day. And so when we hear from today's false politicians that the Palestinians that you hear today are the actual descendants of the Philistines. That's an absolute lie. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. The lands of Canaan that ultimately became the nation of Israel, that lands of the nation of Israel will ultimately change to Palestine through a Roman emperor who conquered the nation in 70 AD and basically destroyed and salted the land and then changed the land as an insult to insult the Israelites in the Jewish nation and to their number one adversary, the Philistines. So when we talk about Palestinian, there's no such thing as a Palestinian land. It's called Palestine because of the fact that it was changed by a Roman emperor in terms of the name. But the original heritage was the Promised Land, Israel, and then prior to that, the land of Canaan. So there's no such thing, once again, a Palestinian, and there's a whole training that we'll go into later on about that. But it's important to understand the true history of this, a history that's not taught today in school. It's just unbelievable in regards to how this twisting of truth has taken place. So hopefully you've gained some good information in regards to the historical events in this time of when Moses was getting ready to help get his people into this land promised by God and who the real inhabitants were. And once again, history is important to understand. History is important to learn. And also it's important to share with the people that you know. Share with your own family members the truth and not get caught up in, I call it today's fake news and the twisting of truth that the Bible tells us about. So once again, we want to thank you for joining us on this sermon. And until next time, may the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord shine his face upon thee. May the Lord be gracious unto thee. May the Lord lift up your countenance and pour out his grace and favor upon thee. And may the Lord give you comfort and peace. God willing, our team looks forward to your next visit to hear our new sermon and catch up on current events related to biblical prophecy being fulfilled in today's times. So God bless you and God bless America.